He knelt in the dust, a warrior's hands holding a crying baby. A promise to a dead woman was the only thing keeping them both alive. But this was more than a promise. It was a death sentence, because an army of killers was hunting this child, and they were closing in fast. How did a lone Comanche warrior end up as the sole guardian of a settler's newborn son? And what secret did this baby hold that made him worth more than all the gold in the territories? The answer is darker than you could ever imagine. Kachi was a ghost, a whisper on the wind. Even his own people, the Comanche, knew him as a man who walked alone. He wasn't a chief. He wasn't a medicine man. He was a hunter, a warrior, and his heart was a cold, hard stone in his chest. A long time ago, something had happened that burned the laughter from his soul. He never spoke of it, but it was there, in his eyes, a hawk's gaze that saw everything and felt nothing. He spent his days on the high crags of Hawk's Peak Mountain, a place where only eagles dared to roost. From there, he watched the world change. He watched the smoke rise from a new settlement the white men called Havenwood. He saw their wagons carving scars into the land his people had roamed for generations. He felt no hate, only a weary sort of sadness. The world was shrinking, and they were the reason why. But he wasn't their enemy, not yet. He was just a witness, an observer from the mountain. He saw them come and go, tiny figures building tiny lives, completely unaware of the shadow that watched from above. He saw the Miller wagon long before it reached the canyon. It was a sturdy thing, pulled by two strong horses. He saw the man, David, walking alongside, his hand resting on his wife's arm. He saw the woman, Sarah, her belly swollen with child, her face full of a light he hadn't seen in years. Hope. They were chasing a dream. A piece of paper in a metal box told them they owned a piece of this land, a place called the Barm Ranch, nestled in a fertile valley with the only reliable water for 50 miles. A gift from the man's father, a place to build a future. They were good people. You could see it in the way they moved, the way they looked at each other. And that was the problem, because in this land, good people died first. They didn't know that the name Marcus Slade was already a poison in the air. Slade was a man who didn't build dreams. He stole them. His gang, the Red River Reavers, were not just outlaws. They were a plague. And Slade wanted that water. He wanted that valley. He wanted that ranch. And he didn't care who he had to kill to get it. Kachi watched the Miller wagon roll towards Whisper Wind Canyon, and the cold stone in his chest felt a flicker of something ancient. A warning. The storm was coming. And these two hopeful souls were riding right into the heart of it. Kachi had been tracking Slade's men for weeks, not because he cared about the settlers, but because they were becoming a problem. They were hunting on Comanche land, slaughtering buffalo for sport, leaving carcasses to rot under the unforgiving sun. It was a waste, an insult. So he tracked them. He learned their movements, their numbers, their habits. He was a phantom at their heels, and they never even knew he was there. He knew they were close, too close. The scent hit him first, smoke and blood. He moved through the broken land with a speed that was not entirely human. His jaw was set, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He found the wagon, or what was left of it. It was a smoldering ruin. The canvas burned away. The wood blackened and splintered. The horses were dead. The man, David Miller, lay sprawled in the dust, his lifeblood staining the earth a dark, angry red. He had died fighting. Kachi could see that. A testament to his courage. But courage was no match for a dozen guns. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in this symphony of death. A thin, weak cry, almost swallowed by the wind. It was a sound of pain, of a life clinging on by a thread. He followed it, his moccasins making no sound on the rock. Deeper into the labyrinth of Whisper Wind Canyon, the cries grew a little stronger. He rounded a sandstone outcrop, his hand on his knife, and his world stopped. There she was, Sarah Miller. Her back was against the rock, and a crimson pool was spreading out from beneath her. Her face was the color of ash, her body racked with pain. But her eyes were on fire. They weren't looking at him. They were looking down, at the tiny, squirming, wailing thing in her arms. a baby boy, born in the middle of a massacre. She saw him then, a tall, formidable Comanche warrior, appearing like an apparition from the rocks. An enemy, the man who should be her death. But desperation changes everything. Please, she gasped, her voice so thin it was barely a sound. She did something then that shattered Kachi's stone-cold heart. She thrust the baby towards him. Her arms trembled so violently it was a miracle she didn't drop him. His name, Samuel. Her eyes locked onto his, and in their depths he saw not a settler, not a white woman, but a mother. A mother whose entire universe had been reduced to this one, final, impossible plea. Save him, she begged, tears carving clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. Vow to me. Vow you will save my son. Kachi froze. The air crackled. The wind died. All the laws of his tribe, all the ancient hatreds, all the codes of a warrior, they dissolved into nothing. He looked at the dying mother, fierce and broken. He looked at the infant, whose only crime was being born. And in that moment, something inside him, something he thought long dead, broke free. The ghosts of his own past rose up, their faces mingling with hers, the face of his wife, the face of his own lost child. Slowly, as if in a trance, he knelt. His hand, a hand that knew only the lance and the bow, a hand that had taken life, reached out. He gently touched the baby's head. The infant's cries softened for just a second. Sarah let out a ragged sob, not of pain, but of impossible relief. I vow it, Kachi said. The words were gravel in his throat, foreign and strange. He will live. A faint smile touched Sarah's lips. Her eyes never left her son. The fire in them softened, the fight went out, and with one last shuddering sigh, she was gone. Kachi was alone, alone with a crying baby, a dead woman, and a promise that had just chained him to a fate he could not possibly comprehend. The weight of it was heavier than any mountain. The silence of the canyon was absolute, broken only by the wails of the orphan in his arms. He was a warrior, a hunter, a man of solitude. What in the name of the Great Spirit was he supposed to do with a baby? The warrior's hands, so steady in a fight, were clumsy as he lifted Samuel. The baby was impossibly small, a fragile bundle of life in a world built for death. Kachi looked down at him, a knot tightening in his chest. This was a new kind of battle, one he had no weapons for. His first instinct was to run, to leave the child, to return to the solitary safety of his mountain peak. But the woman's eyes, her voice, the vow, it was a brand on his soul. He couldn't leave him. He was bound to this child. Using his knife, he carefully cut a piece of Sarah's shawl from near her body. He fashioned a crude sling, securing Samuel against his chest. The warmth of the baby's body was a strange, alien feeling. The faint, milky scent filled his nostrils. It was the scent of a life he had left behind long ago. He had to move. Slade's men could return. He found a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of rock and thorny brush, a place to weather the coming night. With flint and steel, he coaxed a tiny, smokeless fire from a handful of dry scrub, a pathetic little flame against a universe of darkness. But then, a new crisis, a problem his warrior skills couldn't solve. The baby was hungry. His cries were getting weaker, more desperate. He needed milk. But where could he find it? Havenwood was miles away, and walking in there with a white baby would be a death sentence for them both. His own village was a 2-day journey, and he couldn't be sure of the reception. A child of the enemy? They might kill him out of hand. Kachi's mind, a tool honed for tracking prey and planning ambushes, raced. He was a provider. He could find food anywhere. But this was different. He remembered seeing a doe earlier that day, a young fawn at her side. It was a terrible risk. Wasting an arrow on a doe when he needed meat was against every instinct. But the vow was not about his needs. It was about the child's. He gently laid the bundled Samuel near the fire, whispered a silent prayer to the spirits of the hunt, and melted back into the shadows. He moved with the lethal grace of a panther. His bow sang only once. The sound was swallowed by the vast emptiness of the canyon. He returned not with meat for himself, but with the doe. Carefully, awkwardly, using a turtle shell he carried for water, He managed to squeeze some of its warm milk. It was a clumsy, desperate act. He brought the shell to the baby's lips. At first, Samuel resisted, turning his head away. But hunger is a powerful master. He began to drink, weakly at first, then with more urgency. Kachi watched, his breath held tight in his chest. It was working. For now. Days bled into a nightmarish routine. Kachi became a hunter, a gatherer, a protector, a mother. He learned to crush wild berries and mix them with water. He found the softest rabbit furs to create a warm bed. He cleaned the child with damp moss, his large calloused hands moving with a surprising gentleness. He didn't know the soft words a mother would use. He didn't sing lullabies. Instead, he spoke to Samuel in the low, guttural tones of the Comanche. He told him stories of the wind, of the stars, of the hawk that soared above his mountain. And a miracle happened. The baby began to quiet in his presence. He would watch Kachi with wide, curious eyes. His tiny fingers would sometimes find Kachi's own and grip it with surprising strength. The cold stone in Kachi's chest was beginning to crack, but there was no time for sentiment. The shadow of Marcus Slade was everywhere. Kachi never let his guard down. While the baby slept, he would make short, silent scouting trips, his senses on a razor's edge. He saw the smoke from other burning homesteads. He heard the distant pop, pop, pop of gunfire. Slade wasn't just raiding, he was erasing people, systematically wiping the land clean. And Kachi noticed something else, something that sent a spike of ice through his veins. Slade's patrols were more numerous now. They weren't riding randomly. They were sweeping the canyons, the gullies, the thickets. They were organized. They were methodical. They were looking for something, or someone. Were they searching for the woman they thought had escaped? Or did they know about the baby? The thought made Kachi hold Samuel tighter. The vow wasn't just about keeping him alive. It was about keeping him hidden from the wolves. This was no longer just a rescue. It was a hunt. And he and a tiny, helpless baby were the prey. Back at the Barm Ranch, Marcus Slade was not a happy man. He paced his stolen office like a caged animal, the fine wood floor groaning under his expensive boots. The room was filled with furniture and trinkets looted from a dozen homesteads, but the luxury did nothing to soothe the rage boiling in his gut. A scout had just returned from Whisperwind Canyon, and the news was bad. He'd found signs that the Miller woman hadn't died with her husband. She'd crawled away, bled out in the rocks. That was fine. A dead witness was a good witness, but that wasn't all the scout had found. Tucked away, almost hidden under a rock, was a small piece of blood-stained cloth, a piece of swaddling, the kind used for a newborn, a baby. Slade's face, which was already a cruel landscape of sharp angles and cold eyes, twisted into a mask of pure fury. He slammed his fist on the heavy oak desk, sending a bottle of whiskey crashing to the floor. This wasn't about witnesses anymore. David and Sarah Miller had been carrying something he needed, something far more valuable than their lives. It was a piece of paper. The original, government-stamped deed to the Barm Ranch. The one document that proved his own claim, the one he'd forged, was a lie. That deed was the only thing that could unravel his entire empire. The ranch wasn't just land, it was control. Its spring was the only reliable water source for 50 miles in any direction. Whoever controlled the water controlled everything. The cattle trails, the settlements, the future. And now that future was in the hands of a baby who was legally the heir to it all. Find them, Slade snarled, his voice like tearing metal. His top enforcers, a rogues gallery of the cruelest men west of the Mississippi, flinched. A wounded woman and a baby. They can't have gone far. There's a bounty, $1,000 in gold for whoever brings me that child. And anything he might be carrying. He paused, his eyes glittering with cold fire. I don't care if the baby is alive or dead. Just bring me what I want. The promise of gold and the fear of their leader sent the Red River Reavers swarming across the territory like locusts. Their campaign of terror intensified. They hit every homestead, not just for supplies, but for information. They descended on Havenwood, turning the small, hopeful settlement into a town paralyzed by fear. Men were beaten in the street for not having answers. The general store was looted. A pall of dread settled over the dusty town like a funeral shroud. Meanwhile, Kachi moved like a ghost. He abandoned the canyons, climbing higher into the treacherous slopes of Hawks Peak Mountain. The terrain was brutal, unforgiving, but it was a fortress. His knowledge of the hidden game trails, the secret springs, the caves carved by ancient winds was all that kept them alive. Samuel was a constant, heavy weight on his back, a constant demanding presence. But Kachi's resolve was granite. There were close calls. Too many. One afternoon, hiding in a thicket of thorny mesquite, a patrol of reavers passed so close he could hear their coarse jokes, smell the stale sweat and cheap whiskey on them. He held Samuel tight, one hand clamped gently but firmly over the baby's mouth, his heart pounding a cold, silent rhythm against his ribs. The baby, as if sensing the mortal danger, remained perfectly still. His wide blue eyes, so much like his mother's, were locked on Kachi's face. In that terrifying moment of shared silence, the bond between them was forged in steel. The warrior and the orphan, an army of two against the world. Kachi found himself doing things he never thought he would. During the quiet moments when Samuel slept, he would watch the tiny chest rise and fall. A strange, protective ache would bloom in his chest, a feeling he had buried long ago. He started carving small toys from scraps of wood, a hawk with outstretched wings, a cunning wolf, a fleet-footed deer. He'd watch as Samuel's tiny hands reach for them, his face breaking into a gummy, toothless smile. He was still Kachi, the hunter, the solitary warrior, but the sharp, painful edges of his grief were being worn smooth by the innocent life that now depended on him. He was no longer just hiding. He was fighting. He began to use his skills not just to evade, but to deceive. He laid false trails, leading Slade's patrols on punishing, fruitless chases into the Badlands. He'd create diversions, a rock slide here, a stampeded herd of pronghorn there, drawing the reavers away from their true path. He was a phantom, a whisper, sowing confusion and frustration among his enemies. He was one man against 50, but he had an advantage. This land was his. It spoke to him in a language Slade's men would never understand. But he knew it wasn't enough. Hiding and running was a young man's game, and he had a child to think of. Sooner or later, their luck would run out. He had to understand why. Why was Slade so obsessed? It had to be more than just a piece of land. There was a desperation in the hunt, a fanaticism that spoke of higher stakes. He had to find the answer, before the answer found them. The seasons turned. Summer's brutal heat gave way to the crisp bite of autumn. Samuel was no longer a fragile newborn. He was a sturdy infant, crawling now, his eyes bright with a boundless curiosity for the world. Kachi had become an expert at survival. He had found a wild nanny goat that had lost its kid, and with immense patience, had managed to tame her enough to secure a steady supply of milk for Samuel. Their camp was now a series of interconnected caves high on Hawks Peak, a hidden sanctuary almost impossible to find. It was there one evening, with the wind howling a lonely song outside, that Kachi finally found the key. He was going through the few small things he had taken from Sarah Miller's body that terrible day. He had kept them bundled, a final link to the woman who had entrusted him with her son. There was a small worn Bible, a few coins, a silver locket with a faded picture of her and David inside. He'd looked through it all before, but tonight was different. His fingers, more sensitive now from months of gentle tasks, felt something stiff hidden in the lining of the small oilskin pouch that held the locket. His heart began to beat faster. Carefully using the tip of his knife, he worked it free. It was a folded document, brittle and thin, tucked away with a sealed letter. In the dim, flickering light of his fire, he spread the document out. His knowledge of the white man's writing was slow, pieced together from years of dealing with traders and soldiers, but he could read enough. The official seals, the signatures, the detailed description of land boundaries, marked by ancient oaks and river bends. It was the original deed, the true title to the Barm Ranch, signed and witnessed, legally transferring ownership from Martin Miller to his son, David, and by inheritance to Samuel. This was the weapon Slade feared, the paper that could burn his empire to the ground. Then he saw the letter. The seal was unbroken. It was addressed not to David or Sarah, but to a man named Amos Cutter in Havenwood. Kachi's mind raced. Sarah must have been trying to get this to him. This Amos Cutter was an ally, a piece of the puzzle he didn't know existed. The letter was a gamble. Its contents were a mystery. But hiding on this mountain was no longer a solution. It was a slow death. The vow he made was not just to keep Samuel alive, but to save him, to restore his birthright. And that meant he had to do the one thing he had avoided his entire life. He had to go to the white man's town. He had to trust a stranger. He had to go to war. Getting into Havenwood was like walking into a cage full of rattlesnakes. Slade's reavers were everywhere, their swaggering presence a constant threat. They lounged on the porch of the saloon, their eyes scanning every face. Kachi moved like smoke, using the pre-dawn gloom as his cloak. Samuel was strapped tightly to his back, asleep, his face hidden under a flap of tan deerskin. Kachi found the blacksmith shop the letter had mentioned. A light was already burning inside. He could hear the steady clang, clang, clang of a hammer on steel. He slipped into the shadows of the alleyway beside the shop, his heart a cold drum. This was it, the point of no return. Amos Cutter was an old man, but he was built like the anvils he worked. His arms were thick cords of muscle, his face a roadmap of hard years, his eyes a pale, clear blue that missed nothing. He was hammering a horseshoe into shape when Kachi's voice came out of the shadows. Amos Cutter. The hammering stopped. Amos didn't jump. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the darkness. Who's asking? A friend of Sarah Miller, Kachi said, stepping into the dim light of the forge. Amos's face hardened. He put the hammer down, his posture wary. He saw the Comanche warrior, the hard lines of his face, the deadly stillness in his stance. And then he saw the bundle on his back. His eyes widened slightly. By God, he whispered, the rumors are true. Kachi wasted no time. He explained everything. The attack, Sarah's dying plea, the vow, the months spent hiding in the mountains. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, his voice low and urgent. Then he produced the oilskin pouch. He handed Amos the deed and then the sealed letter. Amos broke the seal, his big, calloused fingers surprisingly nimble. He read the letter, his expression grim. It was from Sarah's father-in-law, Martin Miller, the man who had originally tamed the barn. He wrote of his suspicions about Slade, about his illegal tactics, about his fear that Slade would stop at nothing to get the ranch. He urged Amos, his oldest and most trusted friend, to act as a protector for his family and his legacy. The letter was a plea from the grave. Slade's built himself a kingdom on that water, Amos said, his voice a low rumble. He looked at the deed in his hand. This paper, this could bring him down. But it'll take more than paper, son. It'll take blood. His and ours. I know, Kachi replied. Slade has many guns. And the folks in this town are scared to death, Amos continued. He's bled them dry, beaten them down. They've forgotten how to fight. Then we must remind them, Kachi said, his eyes burning with a cold fire. Give them a reason. Give them hope. This child, he is the reason. Amos looked at Kachi, a long, appraising stare. He saw the warrior, but he also saw the guardian. He saw the weight of the vow in the man's exhausted posture. A Comanche warrior, fighting for a white child's birthright? Amos mused, a grim smile touching his lips. The world's gone mad. He paused, then clapped a heavy hand on Kachi's shoulder. Or maybe it's just now starting to make sense. The alliance was forged in the fire of the blacksmith's forge, an old, weary blacksmith and a solitary, haunted warrior, an unlikely pair, bound by a promise to a dead woman. Over the next few days, they moved carefully. Amos was the heart, Kachi the shadow. Amos began to speak to people he could trust, his words quiet but powerful. He spoke to the storekeeper whose supplies were constantly stolen. He spoke to the farmer whose son had been beaten half to death by reavers for sport. He spoke to the stable owner who was forced to give up his best horses. He didn't show them the deed yet. He just planted a seed, a tiny, dangerous seed of rebellion. But Kachi saw something Amos didn't. He saw the fear. And he saw something else. A man. The liveryman. A shifty-eyed fellow named Silas. Kachi saw him watching. Saw him slipping away after a hushed conversation with Amos. Saw him meet with one of Slade's men on the edge of town. they had a traitor in their midst. Kachi went to Amos that night. The man Silas, he is a snake. Amos's face went dark. Silas? I've known him for years. He's scared is all. He is more than scared, Kachi insisted. He works for Slade. Our plan is already known to our enemy. A wave of despair washed over Amos. Their rebellion was over before it had even begun. Then we're finished. Slade will be waiting for us. Kachi looked at him, his expression unreadable. No, we will use the snake to set a trap for the wolf. A new plan was born, a desperate, dangerous gambit. They would let the traitor, Silas, believe the plan was to attack the ranch head-on during Slade's big Founders' Day celebration, a grotesque party Slade was throwing to celebrate his own tyranny. Silas would run to Slade, telling him to fortify the front gates, but the real attack wouldn't come from the front. Kachi had another idea. He had spoken with a young, fiery Comanche brave named Tonkawa, whose band had also suffered from the Reavers' depredations. Tonkawa and his warriors hated Slade. The promise of reclaiming stolen horses and striking a blow against the man who desecrated their lands was all the motivation they needed. They were masters of stealth, masters of the unseen attack. The plan was this. While Slade and his men were laughing and drinking, waiting for a frontal assault that would never come, Tonkawa's warriors would scale the sheer cliff face at the back of the ranch house, a route considered impossible. Kachi, Amos, and a small, hand-picked group of the town's most desperate men would follow. They weren't just going to confront Slade. They were going to take his fortress from the inside out. It was suicidal. It was insane. It was their only chance. The day of the Founders' Day celebration was hot and breathless. The air at the Barm Ranch was thick with the smell of roasting meat and cheap whiskey, but underneath it all was the stench of fear. The settlers who attended did so with smiles plastered on their faces, their eyes darting around nervously. It wasn't a party, it was a command performance. Marcus Slade stood on the porch of the main house, preening like a king, a glass of bourbon in his hand. He was confident, arrogant. His spy, Silas, had told him everything. He knew Amos and some pathetic farmers were planning an attack. He'd doubled the guards at the front gate. He was ready for them. He was practically hoping they'd try. It would give him the excuse he needed to wipe Havenwood off the map for good. He had no idea that his doom was climbing the cliffs behind him. As dusk bled across the sky, Kachi and his small army moved like ghosts. Tonkawa's warriors went first, scaling the sheer rock face with nothing but their bare hands and sheer nerve. They moved like spiders, silent and deadly, their dark forms blending with the rock. Kachi followed, Samuel strapped securely to his back, the boy's quiet breathing, a steady rhythm against his shoulder. Amos and his men, their faces grim and set, struggled up the ropes the warriors dropped for them. They reached the top, a narrow ledge that overlooked the back of the ranch house. Below, the party was in full swing. Laughter and music drifted up, a surreal soundtrack to the coming violence. Tonkawa's men descended, disabling the few sentries with swift, silent efficiency. A thrown knife here, a garrote there. Not a single alarm was raised. Kachi led the way to a small service door at the rear of the house. Amos, who knew the layout from years before, guided them through the quiet, dark corridors. The sounds of the party were a dull roar now, muffled by the thick adobe walls. They moved with a single purpose, neutralizing the handful of guards inside with brutal, silent takedowns. They reached Slade's office. It was a monument to stolen wealth, gaudy and opulent. "Find his papers," Kachi whispered. "The forged deeds." While Amos rifled through the massive desk, Kachi stood by the window, watching the courtyard. He could see Slade laughing, his arm around one of his lieutenants. The sight made Kachi's hand drift to the hilt of his knife. Samuel, now a toddler of almost 2, was awake on his back, his small hands clutching Kachi's shirt. He was quiet, as if he understood the terrible gravity of this moment. "Got him," Amos grunted, holding up a sheaf of documents. The forgeries, all signed by his own hand. "It is time," Kachi said, his voice flat and cold. They didn't go back the way they came. They walked right through the main hall and kicked open the front doors. They stepped out onto the porch, directly behind Marcus Slade. The music screeched to a halt. A hush fell over the courtyard. Every head turned. Slade spun around, his eyes wide with shock. The surprise curdled instantly into murderous rage. "What is this?" he bellowed, his hand dropping to the pearl-handled pistol at his hip. "Seize them!" But his men were confused. They were watching the front gate. The attack was supposed to come from out there. "These men are with me, Slade!" Amos's voice boomed, clear and strong as the steel he hammered. The handful of Havenwood men with him raised their rifles, their aim steady. Slade's reavers hesitated, caught completely off guard. Then Kachi stepped forward into the firelight. In one hand, he held up Martin Miller's original deed. "This land is not yours, Slade," Kachi said, his voice cutting through the silence. "It belongs to the son of David and Sarah Miller." He turned slightly, shifting the sling on his back to reveal Samuel. The little boy, blinking in the bright torchlight, looked out at the sea of stunned faces. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of settlers. This was the ghost baby, the child from the rumors. He was real. "Lies!" Slade shrieked, his carefully constructed composure shattering like glass. "That's a forgery. The Millers are dead. I have the deed. I own this ranch." "The only forgeries here are these," Amos shouted, throwing the papers he'd taken from the office onto the ground at Slade's feet. "Your pathetic fakes. We have witnesses to your murders, to your thefts. It's over." And in that moment, as if summoned by the words, Tonkawa and 24 Comanche warriors melted out of the shadows surrounding the courtyard. They seemed to rise from the earth itself, bows drawn, arrows nocked, every single one aimed at the heart of a Red River Reaver. The trap was sprung. The standoff was complete. Slade was cornered, exposed. A rabid animal backed into a cage. And like any cornered animal, he did something stupid. Desperate. He lunged, not at Kachi, not at Amos. He lunged for the child. Maybe he thought he could use Samuel as a shield. Maybe he thought silencing the last Miller was his only way out. It didn't matter. It was his last mistake. Kachi moved with a speed that was terrifying to behold. He was not a man anymore. He was an explosion of pure, focused violence. With one arm, he shoved Samuel's sling around, putting his own body between the boy and Slade. With his other hand, he drew his long, heavy-bladed knife. The steel seemed to sing in the firelight. Slade, overreaching and clumsy with rage, stumbled right into Kachi's path. Kachi didn't hesitate. There was no honor in this fight. There was no warrior's code to respect. This was not a man. This was a disease to be cured. The fight was over before it truly began. It was brutal, swift, and absolute. There was a desperate grunt from Slade, a choked cry of disbelief. And then Marcus Slade, the tyrant of the plains, the man who built an empire on blood and fear, crumpled into the dust of the ranch he had stolen, his own blood now staining the land he so desperately coveted. A stunned, absolute silence fell over the courtyard. It was broken by a single, ragged cheer from one of the settlers, then another, and another. It swelled into a roar of pure, cathartic release. Slade's reavers, their leader dead, surrounded by grim-faced townsfolk and silent, deadly Comanche warriors, threw down their weapons. Justice, swift and terrible and righteous, had finally come to the Barm Ranch. In the days that followed, the reign of terror ended as quickly as it had begun. Slade's gang was rounded up, their power broken forever. The Barm Ranch, its true ownership now undisputed, transformed from a fortress of fear into a symbol of hope. The people of Havenwood, freed from the boot heel of a tyrant, began to rebuild their lives, their spirits, their town. Young Samuel Miller, too young to understand the bloody battle that had secured his future, was the hero of the hour. A kind woman from town, the blacksmith's wife, took him in, clucking over him and spoiling him rotten. Amos Cutter, with the town's full support, agreed to act as foreman of the ranch, to protect the boy's inheritance until he was old enough to claim it himself. Kachi watched it all from the edges. He was a quiet, solitary figure amidst the celebration. His vow was fulfilled. The child was safe. His birthright was secure. The debt to Sarah Miller was paid in full. He could have left. He could have melted back into the wilderness, returned to his lonely vigil on Hawks Peak Mountain. It was what the old Kachi would have done. But something had changed inside him. The hollow space in his soul, the one carved out by his own past grief, had been filled by the purpose of his promise, filled by the unexpected, fierce love he felt for the boy. He stayed for a while. He didn't mix with the townsfolk, but his presence was a silent guarantee that the peace would hold. He taught Amos the secrets of the land, the hidden springs Slade never knew about, the best places to graze cattle, the signs that foretold a hard winter. He and Tonkawa shared a pipe by a quiet fire, a new unspoken respect forged between the two warriors. They had fought for different reasons, but they had fought together. Finally, the day came when he knew it was time to leave. He went to the blacksmith's house to say his farewell. He found Samuel in the small yard, playing in the dirt with a small, carved wooden hawk, the one Kachi had made for him months ago in a cold cave on the mountain. The boy looked up, his face dirty, and broke into a wide, gurgling laugh. He held up his sticky hands, reaching for the warrior who had been his entire world for so long. For the first time in more years than he could count, Kachi smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He knelt down and gently touched the boy's head, a silent goodbye. As Kachi rode away from Havenwood, the setting sun at his back, he was not the same man who had stumbled upon a massacre in a dusty canyon. He was no longer just a warrior defined by loss. He was Kachi, the vowkeeper, the guardian who had bridged two worlds, not through war, but through an act of impossible compassion. The trail ahead was still his own, but it was no longer a lonely one. He had stared into the face of hatred and chosen honor. He had been given a choice between vengeance and life, and he had chosen life. In saving Samuel Miller, he had not only brought justice to a broken land, but he had finally, after all these years, saved himself. The story of the Comanche warrior and the settler's baby would become a legend on the plains, a tale told around campfire for generations. A story that proves that even in the harshest of lands, the strongest bonds can be forged in the fires of tragedy, and that some vows are truly and forever unbreakable. His silhouette against the fiery sky was that of a man at peace, a man who had found his way home. If you were moved by Kachi's story of honor and sacrifice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We share powerful stories like this every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. And let me know in the comments below. What was the most shocking twist for you? Until next time, stay safe and remember that the greatest heroes are often the ones you'd least expect.